Okay, I guess that's my cue. So yes, let's launch into this thing. I'm so excited that we've been having a great time with this series so far, and I'm sure that today is going to be no different. So I have a few sort of introductory remarks just to warm us up, and then we're going to jump right into the conversation. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the 5th Why Arts Matter panel. This series brings together researchers, artists, and community voices, all represented here, to explore how the arts connect across disciplines and to help us navigate personal, social, and global challenges. At its core, Why Arts Matter affirms the arts' vital role in offering creative insight, critical reflection, and new ways of understanding the world. So no pressure. We're grateful to continue this series in the Improv Lab today, this beautiful space, a space designed for creative exploration, collaboration, and experimentation. It's a place where ideas come to life, where dialogue sparks innovation, and where the impact of the arts can be felt in real time. It's also important to recognize that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Atawandron and Haudenosaunee people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that today this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land where we learn and work. We commit to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We must do more to learn, share, and support truth and healing. Okay, so here in this space today, we're here to explore reality and public spaces, and I'll be interested to see sort of what that turns into, what that conversation looks like when we start having it. But we're excited to have that conversation with our panelists, Eric Fillion, Kim MacLeod, and Rebecca Barnstable, followed by the opportunity for our audience to ask questions. The panel today will discuss how the arts shape public life, social movements, and well-being, drawing on performance, music, and dance as powerful tools for participation, critique, and care. The speakers will demonstrate how creative practices can transform cultural, political, and health systems. Okay, so we're nearly there. I'm just going to introduce our esteemed panelists, and then we'll jump right into it. So first of all, in the order they're written on my sheet, or I don't know if this is... Anyway, Eric Fillion comes first. Eric is director of the International Institute for Critical Studies at Improvisation and assistant professor in the School of Languages and Literatures, specializing in French and Francophone studies. An historian by training and a drummer on an indefinite hiatus, his current research focuses on the post-war cultural public sphere in Canada, Quebec, and the Francophone world, examining the emergence of the arts festival phenomenon and the entangled sonic histories of diasporic social movements, with a focus on both intermediality and improvisation. Eric is the founder of the Tenzier archival record label and author of 2 books, Jazz Libre et la Révolution Québécoise, Musique Action, 1967 to 1975. And Distant Stage, Quebec, Brazil, and the Making of Canada's Cultural Diplomacy, as well as the co-editor, along with Sean Mills and Desiree Rucha, of Statesman of the Piano, Jazz, Race, and History in the Life of Lou Hooper, and Ripple Effects, the work that music festivals do in the world, co-edited with R.J. Hebley. Next, Kim MacLeod. Kim is an artist researcher with a background in directing, devising, and experimental performance. Both her creative and scholarly work interrogate how theater and performance artists engage digital tools to implicate audiences within infrastructures related to public space, digital labor, online identity, and social connection. Kim is particularly interested in how artistic practice can provide avenues to critically reflect on or resist this entanglement. Kim is Associate Professor in the School of Theatre, English and Creative Writing here, and also Editor-in-Chief of Canadian Theatre Review. And last but not least, Rebecca Barnstable. Rebecca investigates holistic treatments for chronic and complex diseases that draw on the power of the arts to support health and wellness. Invested in shifting healthcare policy and direction towards upstream treatment models, such as social prescribing and arts on prescription, she's also worked in community-based healthcare. and a million other things. Rebecca has created dance programs for people with Parkinson's, MCI/Alzheimer's disease, and chronic pain, and trains artists internationally to apply their skills in the emerging field of arts and health. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. So I think we're just going to get started. I'm going to invite each of you just to give us a sort of a 2-minute introductory spiel, just to sort of set the groundwork, and then we will start to chat. Kim, I'm going to pick on you to go first, if that's all right.
I do have some notes to try to stay within this 2 minutes. So we were invited to reflect on the topic of reality in public space and how it intersects with our work. And I feel like both of these things are central to so many aspects of my research, my creative practice, my teaching, and I especially am interested in the flexibility and the slipperiness of these terms. So if I turn first to the term reality, I'm really interested in the plural, usually, realities. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about it for an extended period of time is in work that I've done in the area of XR performance, so the idea of extended reality, and that often houses virtual, augmented, and mixed reality, and my work always tips into the augmented and mixed reality end of that. But I've become really interested in how there's discussions within that field that maybe the X shouldn't stand for extended reality, but should hold any conceptions of new realities coming forward. So I think, and we were also asked, how do the arts fit into this? So I really believe in the ability of the arts to acknowledge and to bring forward an acknowledgement and help us better understand multiple forms of lived realities in spaces together, and also has the ability to really model how we might come together in certain kinds of shared realities. So much of artistic work is about communicating and sending forth how you are experiencing the world. But I think in my work, which is more focused on performance, there's also the ability there to really highlight the interdependence that's necessary when we're building shared realities together. And for me, public space really folds into that as well. So in my work, I'm often thinking about what is public about public space? Is it actually so-called public space? Who is welcomed in? Who is not welcome in certain spaces? What histories are coming to the surface, are visible, and what are not? And a lot of my work is invested in the ways theater and performance artists use technology to create participatory experiences that challenge us to think about everyday use, but also model other ways of moving together, of being together in space, of thinking about the infrastructures in those spaces. And my creative work has long been invested in using performance to activate public sites in playful, unexpected ways. And this has been in a range of ways, activating sites, thinking about histories of protest, navigating questions around security and safety on campuses, and also bringing stories around food security and food justice to light in specific spaces.
Awesome. Thanks. There's so much to talk about there, so that's great. Eric, over to you.
All right. I thought we were going to defer to Rebecca. We had an internal joke going that we would defer to Rebecca for every single question, but we broke the rule right from the beginning. You're good. Thank you, Kim, and I think we agree on a number of things. I'm not surprised there, but certainly in terms of what we picked up on in terms of the question that is asked of us. First, let me just preamble this by saying that I come to this question from multiple complementary perspectives, as a cultural historian, as a curator, as a touring and recording musician on indefinite hiatus. I stopped saying I'm retired because I'm told I can't ever retire from playing music. As a Quebecois cultural worker that navigates across languages and sectors. And so when I look at questions like this or research topics, for me it always looks messy, and that's always exciting. And so not to deflect from the question that was asked, but the one thing that really struck me is the use of the singular for reality. and also for role for the arts. So why not ask, when you think about realities in public spaces, what roles do the art play that nothing else quite can? And the quite here is really important. In my work, I'm always suspicious of claims of exceptionalism, and I think we have to remember that when we're thinking about the arts. Let's always remember that the arts, and I will call them aesthetic modes of communication, they always work in tandem with other modes of communication. So, and that just means that there's always possibilities to amplify and multiply the ripple effects. So what roles, plural, can, right, the arts do? I'll offer specific examples from my research later, but just to synthesize, I would say it can offer alternate and ideally novel ways to communicate that can otherwise be difficult to do through other means. The arts can make it possible to work across differences. It can invite and provide an experience of living and thinking otherwise, of relating to one another, to the moment we are in differently, and that's why I'm thinking of realities in the plural. And most importantly, the arts or its effect can move people in unsuspected ways, and I think this is where the ripple effects come in. Those ripple effects can ripple into public spaces, or if the experience happens in a public space, it can ripple outward into other spaces.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, perfect. Rebecca, we're going to defer to you apparently now.
Okay. I'm going to continue because I love, Eric, that you use this word experience, because for me that's really where I landed with the reality in public spaces, is like, how do we experience these things? So I have my dog-eared copy of John Dewey's Art as Experience over there, which we're talking about in one of my classes. But Dewey says that every experience is a result of the interaction between a live creature and some aspect of the world in which it lives. So in one of my classes that I'm teaching right now, which is the Arts and Human Behavior, we talk about this idea of developing an aesthetic mindset, which is something that artistic experience can feed. So there's a question, one of the big researchers right now in arts and health asks this question, which I think is wonderful, which is, how much time did you spend in the last 24 hours actively engaged in an artistic practice? So it could be listening to music, but it's like actively listening to music, not putting it on and doing something else, but like really immersed in the creativity of it. So if your answer is more than nothing, which it probably is, given that this is probably an audience of preaching to the converted, shockingly, they found that in the United States, for 95% of Americans, the answer was nothing. 0. So my question is more, what do we lose by not having an engagement in the arts? What do we lose in the way we perceive and engage in our environment and the types of experiences that we're able to have? So I kind of took it in a direction. I was more thinking about how aesthetic elements and our ability to pay attention to them allows us to see reality in different ways, to acknowledge that there are other realities, and to shift something. We feel that something can change when we encounter public sculpture, when we see a sudden performance. It's an interruption that lets us know that we're not passive here. We can creatively engage with the world, and we're part of the worlds that we create.
Awesome. Does watching bad television count as engagement with art?
Actually, it's bad for your brain, Andrew.
It's worse than not engaging with art, eh?
It is. We can talk about that later.
Maybe we should. All right.
I think it counts.
Oh, I think as a public service, we should talk about that later. Okay, awesome. So, I mean, clearly, this is already going to be a very rich conversation, so many themes emerging. I'm just going to foreground 3 just to give us some sort of structure, and then we'll just sort of see where the conversation takes us. But I think we've talked about, I mean, the notion of a public space is clearly contested and interesting one, right? So, you know, is there public spaces? What makes it public? Are there particular responsibilities we have when we're acting in a public space that we might not have as artists in other spaces. So I'd love us to talk about that, this notion of reality, multiple realities, the way that art is part of us encountering different realities, whether they're in a public space or not. That seems like, for me, a very interesting thing to talk about. And then I guess just the way in which art does that job, right? So the way in which art, I don't know what we want to say, creates the realities, helps us see realities, encounter realities, enriches realities. I mean, that's a theme essentially through all of the conversations we're having in the series, but another one here. So public space, does anybody want to just sort of grab onto that? What the heck is a public space? Is there only one of it? What makes it public?
I'm happy to jump in because I have
Thanks.
this beautiful little red book, or pink, it's pinkish, it's not red. It's pinkish, the Care Manifesto by the Care Collective. And I just brought it because on page 49 there's a statement about public spaces. So when I read the question, I thought about this immediately. And let me just find it over here. So they write, public spaces are crucial for building caring communities because they are egalitarian and accessible to all, and can foster conviviality, interconnections, and the emergence of communal life, and we can talk about this. But I would just say they're not always that, especially in an ableist world where events or public spaces are on unceded lands. To be fair, the Care Collective does tackle these questions later on, and they do finish this paragraph by saying we must create, we must take back, we must demand more public spaces. And I would add to that we also need to reimagine anew what the existing public spaces are. And how do we reimagine anew? I think it's in great part through the arts. From that premise, I like to think of public spaces that are out there that we can activate through the arts, or that provide a stage to activate the arts, or they can work both ways, as festive agoras. I kind of prefer that term, or like that term, festive agoras. Yeah, agoras.
Okay, festive agoras. Yeah, okay. I like that.
And I'm just throwing that out there.
So agora, because it's a marketplace, because it's public space, festive because of the conviviality. Is that sort of, am I crudely approaching the idea you're trying to capture with that?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
If we approach public spaces in that way, we approach them as potential forums for enacting citizenship. Essentially is why I think the term agora for me makes sense. And festive because I think this work needs to always be fun, right? There's the saying that revolutions happen if the revolutions are there to uplift, to excite individuals. Yeah, we talked about that the other day.
If I can't dance, I don't want to be at your revolution. Yeah. Sorry. Continue? Are you still going?
Go ahead.
Oh, you're done?
I'm done. I'm deferring to Rebecca.
Okay. I was thinking about this slightly differently, but I'd love to connect it with what Eric was saying about the potentiality of fun in spaces. I'm thinking about institutional spaces, like hospitals in particular, which are not maybe necessarily thought of as a public space, but they are a public space. They're shared. And there's so much value in bringing arts and the aesthetics into these spaces. Like there's been research that has shown that, if you have access to a window, if there's arts in the hospital, if you have clowns come into the hospital, if you have things that engage people, I think one of the questions is why do we allow our public spaces to become so alienating and spaces that don't seem to invite gathering and conviviality and fun and potential? And I think that's what the arts reintroduces to these spaces.
Yeah,
Kim,
I'd
what do you
agree
think?
with that. I agree. I'm very interested in how we can play in public spaces. We often have a public space where there is a playground, and it is for people of a certain age, right? But how do we lose that sense of play, and how can we bring it back? But also bring it back in ways that are socially enriching, but also might also do a bit more as well. So play towards some kind of end, model, rehearse ways of being together. And at this particular moment in time, that feels very important. We don't actually look into each other's eyes much anymore. Like this is a real moment of struggle for the arts, partly because people are at home. People are not engaging as much in public spaces, in being together. So how do we make playful encounters, positive encounters that can also work towards kind of larger goals of reimagining public space, reimagining who they're for and what kind of things can happen in them and how we come together as a community?
I want to ask two questions. So the first one, I guess, is straight to you about, so you mentioned the way in which public spaces are maybe more necessary than ever now, and one of the things that maybe you might worry about as an erosion of public space is the kind of extended reality or augmented reality that we were talking about before. So if you think about, as we're all on our phones all the time, we're not looking at each other, we're not interacting. Is there a tension there, or can we use the kinds of tools you were talking about to improve the public space?
So I would believe very much that you can use those tools. I've always been very interested, less in, I am interested in virtual reality, but definitely less in tools that actually augment our experiences in those spaces. So the UK performance company Blast Theory uses the term mixed reality performance in a really specific way that is about layering different kinds of realities on top of each other, often using technology to create these kinds of playful encounters. So a show of theirs I did years ago, you used your phone and you called a number and you interacted with a recording that led you all through an urban space, and you did all sorts of playful things, and eventually it led you to a car park, and you got into a car and you met someone else in this car. I mean, we could get into, there's all sorts of things around comfort and public space and who has cultural capital to do these kinds of things. But that kind of use, I was on my phone, I was engaging through a technology, but it was about actually building a connection with a stranger in that case. So in that kind of way, I'm interested in the ways that technologies can augment space. And I'm a big proponent of the way audio experiences can bring audiences into spaces and transform and augment them in really careful ways that can bring up layers of history, ask questions of community as well, but as a way that doesn't necessarily alter the space permanently. So I think there's lots of ways that technologies and sort of extended reality performance can be doing that don't necessarily involve us with our VR headsets in our own home alone. Right. Not to say that it's not possible in those spaces. There are people definitely working on those kinds of projects, but I am more interested in the sort of augmented and mixed.
Awesome. Yeah, and not to derail the conversation, but the notion of a virtual public space would be an interesting one to think about. But Aaron.
To build on what you were talking about, I mean, there's also a way to sort of work across time with those technologies. Right? Many years ago, I worked on a project on a national park in Quebec, where to create a national park, they had to expropriate and move people out. And it was obviously a disenfranchised community in the first place, which is why the state felt they were entitled to do that. And so the project I worked on was about going and interviewing families that had been moved out or descendants, and then record those interviews, make them available on an interactive website, but also establish a presence in the park so that people, when they were visiting the park, they could actually hear the testimonies of the stories of those individuals. And also, with their phone, they could actually see where the house used to stand, right? So this was part public art, part oral history, part digital history, and it augmented reality in a way, right? It provided layers across time. And of course, this project eventually brought these communities back together, and they started meeting more regularly, even though they had become dispersed. And so this park was a public space, but it existed by, kicking people out.
I think to build on that when technology is used to enhance one of the strongest features of an aesthetic experience, which is to be able to connect with other people, then it is really useful. So even in some of the dance programs I've been involved in, especially during the pandemic, we had to take everything online, which was something I never thought would function. But as we understood during that time when we were isolated, it was through often artistic experiences that made a way for us to connect through screens. We've kept some of those things. I think we learned a lot from them. Also being able to provide experiences to people that wouldn't be able to come out of their house for other reasons to join into something. So I think when we can use technological platforms and devices to enhance the connection, it's great. But I also think it's really important to understand that that is really the power of a lot of artistic experiences, is that it is a super fast way to enhance connection between people and for us to recognize what we share.
Would you want to go as far as to say that it's not the technology, it's not the VR glasses and so on, it's the art, right? It's the connection is built through the ways in which those tools are used to bring about that communication rather than just the fact of the technology itself?
I think anyone who's been in a long Zoom meeting knows that it's not the technology that makes the connection.
But the technology can help you think differently about your art practice,
Absolutely.
right? So
Absolutely.
there's someone in the room that I won't mention right now, but I could. Done a brilliant doctoral project on during the pandemic, fostering co-presence, sonorous coexistence, right, through art making using Zoom rooms, and so the reality of the moment and the technology, raise a number of new questions about how do we relate to one another, how do we foster agency, how do we build community. So I think it works both ways in a sense. Yeah.
Maybe I'll ask my second question, which actually you brought up in your sort of conversation about the first question, which is, I mean, if we're talking now about enriching public spaces by doing art in them and finding ways to connect in them and so on, is that consistent with them being public, I guess, right? So you said something like, who has the cultural capital to actually, bring those things to bear in a public space? If I'm bringing clowns into the hospital, maybe some people don't want clowns in their hospital, right? But there's clowns, right? So, or if I'm doing something that requires a certain technology to experience, some people are doing that and other people are not, right? And so, maybe the question is it still public then, or are we really doing something private or something more narrowly communal just in a public place? And then what responsibility do we have to the publicness of that space? Kim, can I pick on you?
I think a lot of the sort of mixed reality experiences that I've done have felt very exclusive, and some do a better job than others of actually fully disrupting space. So I'll use a different example. The German company Remedy Protocol has had this series for years called Remote X, and it goes to a different city. And so the one I experienced was called Remote New York. And in that one, you're actually on using headphones the whole time, but they rehearse different configurations and groupings of people so that it actually becomes so impossible to move as a group in ways that are safe or normal in a usual city. So at one point, they actually tell the group to cross the street. It doesn't matter if the light is green or not. And the group did, right? So I think these technologies, depending on how they're used, and I don't think that necessarily makes it a better performance. I think that was just one of the goals. So I think there can be really valuable experiences that are about connecting to people, and there can be really valuable experiences that are just doing something different. It's what is the performance doing using the technology? What is it doing in the world? And in that case, that flows outside of the group of people as well, because then the people outside are saying, why is this big group of people suddenly marching down the street, crossing the street when the light is red and the cars just stopped, right? So I think there's possibility for all sorts of kinds of movements and in my work, performance. And it's just they're looking for different kinds of ends. And it's very tricky to say what the effect is of performance. That's something I'm always grappling with. How do you really look at impact? Is it just as valuable if one person is deeply impacted and they're carrying something and they carry that forward into their future work because they had an intimate moment with one other person, or are we looking for other kinds of change? So I think it can be very difficult to assess. And I'd just always be looking at sort of the aims and goals of what a performance is doing in the world.
I think we have to also be mindful when we're talking about arts and public spaces. I don't think this is what we're doing, but we can't work from the assumption that art is always welcome in public spaces, or that our art is welcome in that public space, right? We began this conversation by underscoring how public spaces are generally, by definition, contested spaces. And certainly within the Institute, in my approach and what I've noticed and what I've sort of insights I've gleaned from doing the work I've done on the history of alternative cultures in Quebec, it's always more generative when the conversation is with the community or communities that are invested in those spaces, right? So that whatever you bring in is in dialogue with the need or reality or a disposition of that community. So, because oftentimes there are people who have these brilliant projects, but all of a sudden, whatever they brought into a space is now, you were talking about, hazard or the crossing a street, but there's also mobility issues where you can make a park inaccessible for other people or unwelcoming. And so I think always being mindful of that. And disruption isn't always good either, right? Disruption can do harm.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, in my field, it's more about arts-based facilitation. So it's also that engagement and seeing like what is needed here, and also with people, what do we want to create? There was a second question on this panel about what's the shift from audience to participant. If I'm allowed to like skip there?
Nope, absolutely, do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think this is a really important question, like that thing about, you used an example of clowns in the hospital. And I think in an arts and health model, there's not just one thing that's possible. It's an attitude towards the possibility of there being some kind of clown-based experience happen that would never be imposed upon someone. It's more of an invitation to see what is there that could be co-created between me and you. Maybe you hate clowns, but like what could we find that would be interesting for you? That would be like an experience you want to have. And if that experience is me leaving your room, then that's the experience we will do. But a lot of what we talk about in our classes and in trainings that I do with people is really also awareness that an arts-based experience is very individual, it's culturally informed, there are so many elements. So it's never just one thing, and it is always improvised and co-created. It's not imposed. So I think that's what I was reflecting on in terms of, that's hopefully what makes it health supporting.
Because, it strikes me that not all public aesthetic experiences are like that. So architecture isn't like that, for example, or, public sculpture or street festivals, right? They happen around you, whether you like them or not. So, I think we were sort of exploring the theme that doing those things enriches those public spaces, but what if they sometimes make people uncomfortable? Is that okay? Is that an artistic duty?
I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
So I think a performance theorist, Gareth White, has a really lovely phrase, the aesthetics of the invitation, and that the invitation itself needs to be looked at as an artful act, right? So really thinking through how you are inviting people in to join you in the work that you are doing and presenting. And as part of that, really thinking deeply about questions of access, questions of agency, and really whether, in my work, I think a lot about site-specific work, participatory work, but how are you sometimes reproducing sort of problematic labor relations in these contexts? How are you potentially trying to do something and then you're doing damage in a different way? So, and it can be really tricky. You can be trying to do something without realizing in the moment. So I think slowness and care can really help, and really stepping back and thinking about your starting from like relationality. What is your relationship to a community, to a space, to starting to build work somewhere and taking the time with that. It actually demands a slowing down a lot of artistic process.
And I think this idea of a festival or a cultural event as an example of something that is inclusive and participatory has so many different aspects to it. So if I'm at a festival, I can choose how I want to engage with it. I can choose sort of the depth and the energy of my engagement with what is happening around me. And I think that's also something that's important to think about in this space, is not art as like a static object, but as a dynamic experience that not just as an audience member, but as a participant with agency, I can modulate my engagement with it, and that the invitation, if done carefully, gives me space to imagine myself participating in different ways, and maybe even finding new dimensions of myself in that participation.
Depending on the kind of festival, you may also be surveilled the whole time with a bracelet that tracks your movement and what you purchase and all of that, but these are different kinds of festivals. And this is what we've been talking about, right? There's what the arts can do. It's like there's the aspirational, and then there's the evidence of where it does good and where it doesn't. And just always be nuancing that. And I just worked on a book on music festivals with Ajay, and there's obviously the case of a point to be made that mega festivals tend to cause a lot of harm. But the institutions or the organizations that really thrive and that continue to grow, continue to morph and adapt and respond are institutions that listen to everybody that's involved in the making of a festival. Festival making would be not just the creators or the volunteers, but the artists, the audience members, right? So there's an opportunity for everybody to participate in the reflections that go into organizing an event like this. And it was interesting when you were talking, that example you mentioned about the importance of thinking deeply about how you invite people into a space and slowness. And George Lipsitz, who's a good friend of the Institute, brilliant scholar in the US, sent me a document a year and a half ago about how you arrive, right? And it's essentially the same thing that you're describing, but from the other perspective, right? And it's about when you arrive, you take the time to settle, and you take the time to listen and to connect with everybody, right? And then you move forward once there's a sense that this is a safe place and a caring place for everybody. And if adjustments are needed, it may not be possible to make them in the moment, but you're taking note of that, you're listening. And that, and I like that you began at the very beginning by saying, participation doesn't mean that you always have to be right in there and doing things, right? My sense is as a person that's works with movement, you like people to move. I don't like to move very much, right? I was a drummer, I was stationary, I was seated in the back all the time. And so, I mean, and people are right and, think about music. There's a term that comes up often, and it's almost cliche, but it's Christopher Small's musicking, right? And it's the idea that music is not a noun, it's a verb to music. It's an experience that you participate in. And if you understand musicking as a verb, then just the act of listening is a form of participation. To me, participation is engagement. And if your engagement is just to sit there and absorb it all, and then go home, and then somehow act on that experience, that's beneficial, that's generative, and that's a form of participation. Otherwise, I've been kind of inactive and passive my entire life. And I don't think I've been.
No, c'est pas vrai.
Do you want to jump in, Kim?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think that relates really well, like how you arrive at something, also offering multiple ways in to arrive, multiple modes, and really recognizing that different people are going to come with different experiences and needs. And something that I've been doing for a number of years is thinking about different ways to invite people in. So in sort of participatory site-specific performance artwork, I've often done, would you like to write a response? Would you like to take a picture of something and send it to me later? Would you like to just have a conversation? Would you like to just watch, right? Like, what are all these ways. And it's actually changed. So one of the site-based practices I've been interested in for a long time is audio walks, which we talked a bit about, that kind of audio bringing into a space and adding layers of a space. But maybe somebody doesn't have the ability to go to that space. How can you create an experience so that you can understand it from other locations? And so your example was great. There's a website, you could access it, but you could also go in person as well. How can you think broadly about the ways that people might arrive at some sort of art project? And it doesn't always mean we're physically together.
And togetherness is an interesting concept, especially post-pandemic, right? We've learned to understand co-presence very differently. So yeah, you don't have to be physically present to be.
Oh yeah, so I'd love to pick up on that togetherness notion. So I was going to say that, I mean, it feels to me like the idea that we're sort of arriving at here is that the art in a public space is a participatory invitation, and that is a subtle and nuanced thing, but it doesn't mean that you're sort of forcing it on people, but you're giving people the opportunity to engage with the art in these in a particular way. Is that a form of togetherness? I mean, yeah.
I think so. I'm just gonna throw 3 terms, and then you can do what you want, say what you want. I just want to say it because I just love this term. Georgina Bourne, she was a bass player, I think, for Henry Cow, a British prog band, a brilliant scholar, and she has a term for like sonorous coexistence, or what I would call musically imagined communities, if we're talking about music, and it's the congregation of the affected. People that have really absorbed the effect, or are thinking about the effect of the art that they're exposed to. And so congregation of the affected, I think. It's a great band name, I think.
I love that. I love that. That's wonderful. I was wondering if we should change the word art to like arting, like this musicking, because I think one of the issues is if we talk about like art, it is the art, you know, like it's kind of precludes that participation. So I love that congregation of the affected. Yeah, okay, that's great. Because one of the biggest findings with all of the research on arts and health is that engagement in the arts improves affect, so it improves our feelings, but the main mechanism is through social connection and reducing a sense of isolation. Because we are affected together through our participation. And in participatory forms, we're co-creating, we're engaging in something together, we don't know where it's going. You really do get a sense that you are arting together. The arting is coming through you. It's not something that is external to you, that you are just a passive witness to, but like you are a conduit of what is happening. And I think that wakes us up to our aliveness and the possibilities therein.
I mean, I would agree, mostly, with the caveat that actually it's very hard to do that, though, right? So it can be very tricky to find consensus in community in some formations. So I just want to recognize that it's very hard work to do that in a careful and good way. Yeah, I just felt like saying that.
That's where free-form improvisation comes in. Right? Because you put everyone together and say, work it out. I'm caricaturing here, but I did write a book on a group of left-leaning separatist activist musicians who thought that they would liberate Quebec through free-form improvisation. And the idea was to bring people together, youth, workers, students, anybody really, bring them together through free-form improvisation. They would bring instruments. And then the idea was that they would reconcile their differences through musicking, and that they would, through that experience, feel a sense of agency, feel liberated, realize that, you know, this is what the democratization of arting is. I'm doing something a historian should be doing, is using a new term for something in the past, but And then the idea is if you liberate yourself individually, you can liberate yourself as a group, as a collective, and then as a nation. And then ultimately Quebec was going to become separate. It's a failed project, but I like failed histories.
It's interesting that you talk about it being hard and that it sometimes fails.
Yep.
But I would say, like, this is my primary practice. My artistic practice is like I'm a dancer, but I'm not a performing dancer. I've often looked for a term for what I do, but mainly I work with groups of people to find that. And some people call it facilitation. I sometimes call it orchestration, because it's like helping people find their way to be an instrument in something that unfolds between us. But it is difficult, and it's also weirdly innate. I find that once the conditions are set up and people start to find it, it happens. And it's amazing how much we have the capacity to do things that we don't practice in everyday life, that we could.
Is this the moment to talk about bad TV? Is bad TV problematic because it's not arting?
Can we agree on what bad TV is?
Yeah, that's a...
All I will say about bad TV is that when that question about like actively engaging in the arts, so there's things like cinema or something where you're kind of working for it a bit, you're figuring out what's going on. But let's say bad TV is like you're really passive. I think the difference is if there's something happening that you are not actively engaging in the storyline in some way, or you're not sitting with your friends making jokes about what you're seeing or something, you're just really passively taking it in, it's not as good for you as something where you feel more creatively engaged.
Yes and no. There's an artist in Quebec, his name is Richard Martin in English. Monsieur Richard Martin. In the late 60s, he was interested in experimental music, and there was no one in Montreal that could supervise him, so they shipped him to the US. He met John Cage and, Lamont Young, Terry Riley, worked with these folks. And when he was there, he got super interested in experimental scores, and he came up with a score that was essentially just a series of instructions that would be projected on the screen, and people were invited to just perform the score. And it was a silent score. Essentially, it was asking people to put fingers in their ears, turn their fingers, clack their teeth, right? He got a really positive responses to the extent that it was actually printed in Source, which was one of the most celebrated experimental avant-garde publication at the time. He came back to Quebec right at the moment when video art exploded, and he's like, I'm gonna make this for television. And so he made a video of his score so that people could do it at home alone. And the idea was for people to come to the realization that when they're experiencing something, if they're mindful of what's happening, they realize that they are there, right? There's no point in saying it in French because I'm still learning French here, but the idea was that if you stop and you think about what's happening, you come to the realization that this experience is happening because you're aware it's happening. You become aware of your presence. And a lot of people are looking at this as passive video art, but it's extremely powerful, right? And people were doing like these video feedbacks, these like really like Nam Ju Pig, like putting like magnets on television to mess up with the image. And he came up with this like black print on a white background of like turn your finger in your ear. And it was as strong as a political statement and transformative, I'd argue.
Yeah, but this is not bad TV.
But he understood it to be bad TV, and people were telling him it's bad TV.
But I think this is a really good example, that idea I brought in at the beginning, the aesthetic mindset, which is that, if you experience something, you give yourself to the experience, you realize you're having an experience, and that is part of it. And this is actually very engaging. You had to like stick your fingers in your ears, like you were not just like.
Are you getting at a bit like when our bodies are engaged in some way? It doesn't matter necessarily.
Not necessarily. Even if it wasn't stick your finger in your ear, if it was like just to be aware of the experience, I think the fact that it was so simple, I mean, you wouldn't just sit and watch it. You have to read it, you have to respond to it, you have to think about it. So it doesn't necessarily, I mean, our bodies are always engaged in everything, but it doesn't have to be like a large bodily movement.
I don't have a counterexample. Yeah, others than to say I am interested in like high-low art divides, and I get a little nervous around the sort of saying TV bad.
Me too.
Because I think I don't know, like all forms of performance, there's so many effects and impacts that can be so hard to see in the world, and different communities might come towards a show for a reason, right? So I'm always very aware of like the specific contexts of any type of performance and how people engage with it and then carry it into the world. And I feel like I'm just cautious about just taking any type of thing and putting it in a box because of that. But I think, this question of how we engage with different arts and arting together is really important, because I think there's also very well-meaning other kinds of arts, like site-specific performance, that can actually close people off from one another too, in terms of how that invitation happens, how people are invited into public spaces can actually reproduce some damaging things too. So yeah, I think you just have to think about context a lot.
So we talked about the power of art in public spaces. We've talked about sort of the way in which art needs to be arting, needs to sort of engage and be participatory. You sort of mentioned the way in which art can be powerful, and so we've talked about togetherness, we've talked about improving people's affect, we've sort of mentioned sort of a health connection through the hospitals. In your introduction, you talked about exposing people to different realities through art. So maybe we could just sort of talk a little bit about that, because I also think this theme that's emerging, that art can be powerfully good, but maybe I'm extrapolating here, but the thing that makes it powerfully good can make it bad, right? It can it can push people apart as well as bring them together. So do you have thoughts on why art, understood broadly, is beneficial? Is it, I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to shut up now. Is art good?
Is art good?
What is good?
What is good? What is good?
Hoist with my own petard now.
Okay, I will take this in a direction that is just like a really literal direction, more to do with the work that I do, and then we can ask some questions about some of the more nuanced things, because of course there can be art can be alienating. You know, it can also be used not for good. Music has been used in torture. You know, it's not always good. But I think there's a whole there's an aspect of intent. There's an aspect of the way that we engage in the arting. But one thing I would like to share, there's this idea from Daisy Fancourt again in the UK saying that that art could be thought of now as the forgotten fifth pillar of health. Like, we know that it's good to do exercise, you know that you should eat well, you know you should get sleep, but what are we missing by not participating in art? If we went back a few generations, all of us would have engaged in things like crochet and making clothes and playing music around a kitchen table. There are all kinds of everyday, highly accessible artistic experiences and folk experiences that would have been part of our lives. We would have baked our own food. We would have had this daily corporeal engagement in creating things. And that's something that we don't do nearly as much. So I think that the question that's interesting to ask is, what are we losing when we lose those things? How are we becoming more disengaged and alienated from our reality, from the clothes we wear and the food we eat and the possibilities for connection when we go home and watch bad TV alone? No, I'm sorry about the TV. If you like TV, it's really fine. But it's like, it's not the same kind of engagement that you would have if you went home and picked up an instrument or cooked together with friends or family. And the other thing to note is that artistic experience, arting, is multisensory. It's going to have all kinds of different aspects that are engaging us in deeper ways with our experience and with each other and with the possibilities of what we can share. So I think that's why arting is good.
Eric, is arting good?
I vote to adopt the verb arting.
Arting.
I like that we're including in this, not just what is commonly in certain circles defined as arts, right? We're thinking really broadly about arts or arting, about culture, and I think it's important we do so because it also makes us more attentive or sensitive to the ways in which art appears in our life. How you were talking about disrupting, let's talk about disruption, but in a good way. And I'm going to bring us back to 2012, the student protests in Quebec. So massive protests in Quebec because of tuition hike. If there's a tuition hike in Quebec, there's going to be a protest. You can, even if it's 2 cents. And so 2012, we have the biggest, longest lasting student protests in Quebec in Canadian history. It lasted for months and months and months and months. And the government tried to shut it down by passing a law preventing people from assembling, and it just backfired, which it made it last even longer. And part of this protest was to have it going 24 hours a day. So there were protests during the day and there were night protests. And night protest was not 200 people, like it was thousands of people every night meeting at the same place. And this was accompanied or augmented or amplified through various sort of artistic interventions. One was the pots and pans concerts, the concert de casserole, which happened at 8 o'clock every night. People were invited to get outside on the street, public spaces, and bang pots. And that went on forever. And if you were annoyed at the beginning, by the second month, because it lasted for months, you were like, I'm going out, right? Yeah. And maybe I'm not gonna bring a pot, but I'm gonna be in there, right? The other thing that happened, they did so many beautiful, they had so many beautiful initiatives, the students, but the other thing they did is they did the ligne rouge. So the subway system in Montreal is, you refer to the lines by their color, the green line, the orange. So when I moved to Toronto, I did that and I was reprimanded. You don't do that in Toronto. You don't refer to the lines by their color, but in Montreal you do. There is no red line in Montreal, but red was the symbol that the students had used to denounce the austerity measures of the government. And they had little red squares over here that I should have put on, but it's over there. Hey, I can give it to you if you want. There you go. And you wanna, I'll give you a safety pin after to put it on. Oh, it sticks.
Yes.
And so hundreds and hundreds of students every morning during rush hour, they dressed in white, in red, and they created a parallel alternate red line across the subway system that cut across all of the other colors. And they just, they weren't people's way. They just stood there, sang songs, handed out little red squares and pamphlets, and if they were asked information, they would talk about it. So it was a performance. It was performance art. And what they did essentially through all of this, the concerts and the red line, is they built community around their issue. They built intergenerational community. They created places where people with different occupations or mobility issues could participate. Their art was a form of free speech. It was a means of communicating information. Yeah, I just thought it was brilliant and so comprehensive. A lot of people might not think of that as art, but yeah, or arting.
It's arting.
All right. So, Kim, I think you pretty much have the last word. Oh. Culturing good.
Is culture good?
Culturing. I'm going the whole verbing thing.
Yeah, I do think there is another thread we could go on in terms of how Eric just answered that around sort of repertoires of protest and how artful they often are too, and how that is a form of art making as well, very big one in public space. So that's a great example of why art really does matter in these spaces. And it is about building community at the end of the day in these examples, and doing it really thoughtfully with care and responding to pressing sort of issues and crises of the current moment, and having art there in both, like in homes to create community, and then in these much larger spaces as well. So it scales it can scale up and scale down really well. So that.
And cut across time and space
Yeah.
because of
Yes.
this idea of repertoire, right?
Yeah.
The repertoire cuts across time and space. Like old works, old practices are revisited, expanded, repurposed. Yeah.
And it can make you live longer. According to epidemiological studies, if you do at least one thing a week, like go to a museum, go to a show, experience your life as arting, you will live longer and prosper.
And have a richer life.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Thank you. On that note, that's a super note to end on. I mean, there's plenty more we could be talking about, but we're out of time. We should get to the audience for some questions, but thank you so much. This has been super interesting. So on that note, we've got a couple of mics. If people have questions or stirring defenses of bad television or anything that they want to contribute, come on up. The lights are in our eyes and can't necessarily see you.
Because you just referred to defenses, I just want to, because I made a reference to a doctoral dissertation earlier, and I just want to, it's Brent Rowan, who's right over here. So.
You have a question, Brent? Go ahead. No, okay.
I have a question.
Please.
It's interesting because we're talking about activating public space with senses of community and relational works. What about the notions of relational aesthetics that have been brought forth by people like Nicholas Borio and Deleuze and Guattari as examples also, who see the idea of relations as being an aesthetic principle in art making? And wasn't really brought into this conversation. I'm just curious how you guys feel about that notion, because it is controversial. You got people like Claire Bishop, who doesn't believe that those relational aspects make art, but make community. I'm just curious what you guys feel about that.
Thank you, Mike. I think they do both. I'm reading a fantastic book right now titled The Revolution Will Be Improvised, and it's about activist theater groups in the US in the 60s and 70s. And it's a brilliant book because it looks at arts in US civil rights movement through archives. And the argument is that ultimately what stays is the intimacy making, right? So the relations, essentially. However powerful, impactful, lasting the art is, or whether or not they achieve what they were working for in terms of changing a policy or whatever, ultimately the relationship making or the intimacy making that happened in the process of doing that art is what gives it resonance. And why the book is so fascinating is that it provides a way of finding that evidence in text-based archive or video multimedia archives. It's fragmented, of course, or not complete, but so yeah, I would tend to agree.
Yeah. I can jump in. I would say it can do both, and I think there is the danger there, though. I think around institutionalization, that kind of concern that comes up around the relational aesthetics, and I think it goes back to who has access to these things. What is it actually doing in the world? And these things can get co-opted too. So whose performance works in all types of social settings and different sort of political contexts. So I think we do want to be attentive to questions around how do things get framed, how do different strategies get used in different contexts.
And in a really practical example, I would say a lot of the work that I do really is about inviting that intimacy to exist and create space for it. Like as a dance therapist, I'm not looking to create an aesthetically beautiful piece, but people leave with a beautiful feeling. And that feeling is more what is experienced between them. Maybe we see very little from the outside.
And it's not in relation to that book that I was referring to, right? And what you just said is that good feeling is not just, that's not just the outcome. It's because that good feeling ultimately leads to a disposition of openness and a willingness to listen and engage in other projects or experiences that this person is going to go into.
Yeah.
Excellent. Looks like we have a question from Sharon over here.
Yes, thank you. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for hosting this. I'm thinking a lot about this in terms of the space here at the university that we might consider as public spaces. And so some of the conversations and the collaboration, I'm thinking a lot about public and art making through research, communities of research, because that too is kind of how we work within the Institute, and we need those collaborations, and it's what makes university life collegial. And so I was wondering if you had thoughts, if anyone had thoughts on kind of art making or research as art making, research as that kind of bridge between the public and art making, and then even like hallways as a public space for that kind of instigation of aesthetics and effective. I really like the quote, nope, I lost it. It was something, hold on. Oh, the congregation of the affected. And so like the meetings in the hallways too, which for kind of how I'm thinking about what I'm doing has been a rich source of community making and the aesthetics of interaction.
Yes. Yes to hallways. About research and community making, I was really excited this morning because I actually got invited to give a talk in biology about participatory research practices, because people are interested in learning about how in the College of Arts and through arts-based research, we engage in a very different way with participants, with the idea of data, with the idea of experience, and what can we learn from each other. So I think there's a growing recognition that the types of research that we do, which can be about creating a community rather than treating people as objects, has potential to be really transformative. And to link it back to something that Eric said about different types of festivals, like the mega festival is a capitalist structure. And I think that as soon as we get into capitalism and extraction and objectification, or like, you know, the art object, this is where alienation comes from. So as long as we are focused on the relationality, the thing between us, the thing that cannot be commodified, but that lives in the space between us, then I think we're talking about arting, which is good.
And those mega festivals, they can also inadvertently act as host to what the concept that we use in this book that Audrey and I just assembled it, edited a collection, and subordinate spaces, right? So within those mega festivals, that can happen. A good example is the Montreal Jazz Festival several years ago. Robert Lepage organized or staged a performance based on slave songs with a mostly white cast. And it led to massive protests and led to artists deciding that they were not going to participate in the festival, right? And this mega festival that from the outside looks pretty cool, but if you're in Montreal, or the Montreal Jazz Festival is a bit annoying. And so to have this festival become the host of an insubordinate space that generated so much beautiful activism, beautiful art, is inspiring. And you know, it means that there are ways to try and flip the script when you're encountering these mega events or structures. To go back to your question, Sharon, hi. When you mentioned hallway, every time someone mentions hallway, or hallways plural, like I think about my time in Brasilia. Anyone here has visited the University of Brasilia? It's amazing. The hallways, open sky. So you're walking outside and the classrooms are on each side. And so when you congregate between classes, you're outside with vegetation, with the sky. It's beautiful. Obviously we can't do this here because it's winter, but yeah, definitely. And when I look, the work that I do, I look at all, if I'm looking at a festival, I'm looking at what's happening around the festival. I'm looking at all the other sites that are adjacent to it. If I'm looking at a concert venue, same thing, right? Or the head office of a nonprofit organization. I will also look at all the other spaces that people have to pass through to get to that site. And I think your other question, Sharon, was about research creation, community, and art on campus. Research as arting, yes. I think so. Yes, absolutely. And I will say that I stumbled my way into academia because as an artist, I was always a researcher, right? And so what I'm doing here is no different than what I've always been doing. So 100%. And I've said this about critical studies and improvisation as a field. And I think I can say this broadly speaking about interdisciplinary programs or cultural studies. Those are containers. I don't like the word containers because it's confining, but they're homes for outsiders. And research creation is really a place for outsiders, I think, to move our thinking forward in terms of what is research, what is art, or arting, sorry. So yes, I think this is all, those boundaries are always fluid, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think about this most actually in my teaching, in really trying to continually weave together with theater students this mixing of research and practice, and how that they're constantly informing on one another and blending. And one of the ways we can do that is thinking about the spaces that we are in together on campus. And when I used to teach our introductory performance class, which was quite big, it was 90 at the time, I would say, well, we're going to use the campus as our studio. So you're going to go and do workshop assignments throughout the campus and think about performance really critically in embodied, in scholarly ways, thinking about the campus and the way people move through the campus, the way people create desire paths through the campus, where they congregate. What happens if you do a small performance score? How do people react when you break the everyday? So I think it's actually, there's such a rich space in this campus to continue to do that kind of work. And I love doing that work with students and getting them to think deeply about histories of space and about what space as material can offer for things like devised performance. So yeah, I would say it's very rich, and they're always doing it from a research and practice lens themselves as well.
Excellent. We maybe have time for one quick question, if anybody has a last question.
I do actually have a question now.
All right.
So just to pick up a little bit, that all of that kind of triggered a question of, what's already here, and how do we look at and use what's already here? Do we have to always recreate some activity to engage the people in? And I'm also thinking about the Daisy Fancourt book, the Art Cure thing, where we're talking about social prescribing and things like that. So how do we get from that step of like, nobody's social prescribing to actually convincing people that what's already here is really helping for them? I'm trying to get onto that verb train.
Helping.
Helping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
So how do
No,
we
that may
use
be a
arting
verbing too
to
far.
do helping? Yeah. But
Arting
how
and
do we get
helping.
the doctors to prescribe it? How do we get everybody to realize that it is really good for us? Like, we know, but how do we get all the other people?
Sadly, there's an economic argument for it. There's a lot of really great research right now that is using health economics modeling to demonstrate that like the arts are always considered as an extra, but what if we don't think of them as an extra? But what if we think of them as integral? And if they're missing, then something important is missing for the entire system. So a lot of the really persuasive research coming out of the UK, and even some in Canada, shows that every dollar put towards maintaining artistic experience, and this is really broadly understood, you know, cultural spaces, museums, public art, equals between 4 and 11 times the savings in terms of people being able to continue working because you have reduced debilitations in mental health. You have people who are living longer independently and longer what's called a health span. So it's like years where you are healthy and able to do things. So I think that the economic argument, as much as I was poo-pooing capitalism, is persuasive within a capitalist system. And then I think it's just a matter of raising awareness about it. So my class that I'm teaching right now, their final exam is actually, yeah! Their final exam is they have to create pop-up art cures throughout the campus. And in first year, we kind of talked about the benefits of arts for ourselves, you know, preaching to the choir. But now it's taking this outside of our classroom into the space and engaging people that have not thought about this before and just getting them to try something and then noticing the impact for them. So I think this is the kind of thing, if you try it, it's a really easy drug to sell. Try it and you'll know that it had a good effect on you. I was here for the open house and I had a bunch of students and parents who were considering coming here. And I was trying to talk to them and they were very like, I think they've been watching too much TV.
Bad
but,
TV?
But they were watching bad TV. So I was like, you know what? I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Like, let's come sit in a circle. I had a speaker. I put on a song, and I asked 2 questions. One was, I said, you know, right before we start, I want you to get a sense of like how you're feeling right now on a scale of 1 to 10, and how connected do you feel to the people sitting around this circle? Chart your number. And then we moved together to one song. And by the end, everybody's number went up, especially in social connection. And students that had walked into that room, not knowing each other and feeling very shy, left laughing and talking to each other, and they were transformed. They had a transformative experience in one song. So I think that we just need to be willing to try. We need to be willing to create these experiences. We need to think more broadly about arting as something that we should have access to, and we should promote access to for everyone. And we should notice more like when it's missing and where we can help insert that again.
I think Andrea wants to know, and I also want to know what's the song.
Oh, I had a mixed generation audience, so I did Bill Withers, Lean on Me. Classic. Come on.
I think it's, I mean, we've been talking about, you know, terminology and how do we, I think a lot of people don't realize the amount of art that's already in their life, right? And how legitimate as aesthetic modes of communication these practices or those objects or are, right? And it's not always about creating something new. And, you know, when I research art and social movement, it's you know, if you're looking at social movement anthems, for example, it can be the same song, but it's some sort of political accumulation that happens over time as it's repurposed, reappropriated, reimagined. And so getting people to also grasp that a song, for example, that seems to be like an old song can have multiple lives and multiple meanings for different communities. And can be, we started this conversation by talking about how we need to reimagine anew a lot of the things that our public space to start with. So I think what's already here, we don't always have to create new works or new practices, but we always have to think about what we have. And sometimes that thinking leads to new insights, new co-created knowledge. But there's an amazing wealth of repertoires, to go back to what we're talking about, that to work from, and it's always about continuity, at least to me.
Yeah, I might cheat a little in my answer, but I agree. I mean, we're never making anything in a vacuum anyhow, but I'm also So we need to be attentive to those things that already exist. I will cheat because it is going to be about making new, but I am a big proponent of, like, especially when working with students, introducing devising practices. Theater students often know script, right? Like, you work towards making some words, or you do the script. And I am leading students right now through, what if we start with sight? What if we start with place? What if we start with texture and sound? What if we start with objects? So we've gone into the prop storage in the basement of Massey Hall, and they've selected objects, and they just begin with the question of, like, what was this object used for? Where did it come from? What are all the material conditions around this object? What are all the sensory reactions I'm having to this object? How can we make from there? And it might lead into something very new. They're going to add fictional layers, but I think it goes back to those, like, layers of reality. There are constraints on their performance and parameters, but they can be blending together fiction and reality, and that can be making something new, but it's always about what's there before. So you're just building on that.
Well, and just to link it back to something right at the beginning, that's that aesthetic mindset. It's like, at any moment, we can be awake to the aesthetic dimensions of where we are. And this is a beautiful campus. And even if it was ugly, I was at York before, it's a brutalist nightmare. But you can appreciate it. But being awake to the arting that's already there.
I just want to be, when we talk about aesthetics, like, to me it's always important to qualify it. I try not to use aesthetics on its own. I always think about social aesthetics, right? Because to me it's always situated politically, culturally, geographically. I'm just trying to avoid the terms that evoke or convey some idea of universalism.
I was thinking about neuroaesthetics, and I think this is going to be our next panel, because I think we just opened a whole box of stuff.
I think you're right. Neuroaesthetics, social aesthetics, that'll be next time. Stay tuned, folks. Stay tuned. Kim, Eric, Rebecca, thank you so much. It's been just great. Thank you very much. And thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much.